Welcome back to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I am your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with me is our senior fellow, Alan Dowd. Welcome back, Alan.
Always good to be here, Joy. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Doing well.
Good. And we were going to talk with Alan about his latest article, but also an update from the Arctic Council from our last podcast, as we talked about Russia in the Arctic, and also address the China-Russian military exercises off the coast of Alaska, which ties in with Alan's latest article titled Maintaining a Cold Peace. And you can find all of Alan's articles at our website, www.ascf.us. Sign up to join our newsletter. And if you would consider becoming a member of ASCF so we can keep these podcasts and articles coming to you. On our last podcast, Alan, I thought Russia was the current president of the Arctic Council, so I just wanted to state that correctly. They are not currently. Norway took over in May of 2023. And in fact, Russia had been the previous president, but when they invaded the Ukraine, the council has decided to suspend that in March last year of 2022. So, Alan,
go
ahead.
That's a good clarification, but I think you were awful close. So it's not.
I was.
And
close.
It was just.
I was.
It was in your defense. It was literally just a pro forma handoff because the council isn't operating, as you know, and Norway, Russia just pro forma handed it off to Norway, and I'm pretty sure the council isn't doing much of anything now. So.
Yes, thank you for saying that, because they did clarify that there is a lot of suspension at the moment due to the Ukraine-Russian situation. And as I'm going to get into in a little bit here, that every single member state of the Arctic Council is a NATO nation except for Russia.
That's right.
So how that plays out will be interesting to see. But as you pointed out in your article, it's important that we remember that the U.S. is an Arctic nation. Alaska is very close to Russia, as we've recently been reminded of the joint China-Russian military exercises near our Alaskan coast. Noah, if you could show us the first map on Russian Arctic bases. Thank you. So to our listeners, this is a map just kind of showing what we talked about in the last podcast, and to reinforce today's is where Russia has their bases in the Arctic, as well as you kind of get an idea of where Alaska sits, the U.S. sits, and some of the other member Arctic nations. And then second, if you can show us the next map. And this might help a little with the flags of the different member nations and the disputed areas, as well as all the pinpoints of oil and gas reserves and minerals, which is a big deal for the ice melting up in the Arctic area. So, Alan, if you could brief us a little on the importance of Alaska to the U.S., both economically and militarily.
Well, sure. There's a whole bunch of resources, natural resources that Alaska contributes to the country. Obviously, was always known or thought to be a bonanza for natural resources. In fact, it was more than we even surmised back in the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, when we were able to acquire Alaska. But the big one, of course, is energy resources, things like oil and natural gas. Alaska, south of the Arctic, holds more than 10 billion barrels of oil, 24 billion barrels of oil, and 126 trillion cubic feet of gas are located offshore Alaska. Alaska produces somewhere between 4 and 5% of the oil consumed here in the U.S. It's an important source of energy and an energy security. You and I have talked about that before, and the Alaska is a key part of that in America's. I think America's energy future, is I think we may be trying to skip ahead too much to a post-petrol economy. I think we'll get there at some point, but until we get there, these resources in places like Alaska are crucial, and I think we'll see them even in more graphic relief in the coming years, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know there is a lot of talk of trying to go more green and all the electric vehicles, but I do believe there is a consensus that agrees with you in the fact that we may eventually get there, but we do need our oil reserve back up.
Yeah, and that's that's part of the energy piece is really, I think, the key to understanding why Putin is doing the things he does in and around the Arctic, because Russia's economy is so, I guess, unidimensionally, committed to, focused on, dependent on natural energy resource wealth. Mm-hmm. Russia claims a huge part of the Arctic, a lot of it without any justification, but some 463 square miles of Arctic territory, and the reason is that they need energy resources to keep their economy going. And the Arctic is full of that. I mean, well outside Alaska territory, it's estimated some $35 trillion worth of untapped oil and minerals are there in the Arctic. U.S. Geological Survey estimates the Arctic holds over 1,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, somewhere near 100 billion barrels of oil, and Putin, whose economy is dependent on energy resources, is eyeing that because he knows that that's essential to keep his oligarchs happy in their corruption, graft-riddled economy, and to keep the economy going. When Putin himself said, Joy, natural resources are of paramount importance for the Russian economy, they're concentrated in the Arctic region. He's really not pulling any punches or doing anything tricky here. He's very, very clear about why he's deploying military forces, and your maps are very good at showing listeners and viewers where those bases are, and the reason they're there is to justify and support these claims, some of these claims being outrageous and way out of our Russian territory.
Yeah, I had some questions about that, I think, from our last conversation, and the fact that Russia does have the largest coastline along the Arctic,
Sure.
but their claims seem to go a little further than their Arctic coastline. And how far can they push toward the North Pole? I understand that they put a flag on the North Pole underwater, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a symbolic, they had some type of unmanned submarine that did that years ago, kind of a symbolic, literally staking the claim. They claim half the Arctic Circle, the entire North Pole. Again, it's because of resources. But they base these claims because of their interpretation of an underwater ridge that connects to the Russian landmass, and their interpretation of that is that gives them justification or a claim over the big swath of territory. I think one of your maps shows that, which it's disputed by all the other members of the Arctic. And, Joy, that happens all the time between allied countries, between friendly countries, that there's a dispute or a disagreement over territorial claims. A lot of times it's in the seabed nowadays, and those disputes, those disagreements are resolved through negotiations, through treaty processes, sometimes through international arbitration, and they're resolved that way. But in the case of Russia, they're not going to be open to resolving these things that way. They're going to make the claim and use force to back up the claim, and that's clearly what they're doing in the Arctic, and that's his modus operandi everywhere, Putin. So that's why I've advocated for many years. These articles that you've published the last couple months amplify that, but I've advocated for many years that the United States and its NATO allies deal with Putin from a posture of strength, be clear, be firm, be open to talking, but back up those words with muscle. And that's really the only thing that Putin understands is muscle.
Yes, I read that in your paper, and I totally agree. In fact, when I said if you could speak militarily in your paper, you talked about our troops in Alaska and as well as the exercise training with our NATO allies and the Arctic member states.
Yes, it's, the United States has, in the last several years, over a couple administrations, enhanced and begun to focus seriously on Arctic security issues, on making sure that U.S. interests are protected and defended up there. There's some 27,000 U.S. troops in Alaska now. The Biden administration reformed, for lack of a better term, an Army division to kind of consolidate and rationalize and harmonize the U.S. Army's efforts up there into I think it's the 11th Airborne now is what it's called. It existed a long time ago, and it's been recreated, reconstituted. The largest collection of U.S. fifth-generation warplanes, those are things like F-22s and F-35s, are located in Alaska. So militarily, the U.S. is thinking seriously about it. The Biden administration created a new post inside the Defense Department focused on Arctic issues. So that's those are all welcome developments on our side. And
I think sending the warships was a great move by the administration as well to show deterrence as we talk about peace through strength, Eric, a lot.
Yeah, so you're talking about in response to what the Russians and Chinese did the other day? Yeah. Oh, yes, that was essential, and it was good that the Navy could react that quickly. To get 4 warships up there, an 11-ship flotilla of Chinese and Russian ships. Now, Joy, they never entered U.S. sea space or U.S. waters, but they did approach some of Alaskan territorial waters. And so it was good that the Navy was able to respond that quickly. It's another argument, yet again, they come up every week almost, and you and I have talked about it. American Security Council Foundation's advocated it for years. Of course, President Reagan understood it. The importance of having a big Navy to deter, not to wage war, but to deter war and to defend America's many interests around the world. And right now, our Navy is not nearly large enough for what it needs to do. That's not according to me. That's according to the Chief of Naval Operations, who says we need more than 500 ships. We have less than 300. Yeah. So when you have a large Navy, you're able to dispatch them when they're needed, where they're needed. So it was good that we could get those 4 ships up there to let the Russians, and I think we had some anti-submarine tracker warplanes up there too, tracking the Russians and Chinese, but we don't have nearly the naval force to do what we need to do and what we used to be able to do.
No, in fact, I'm thinking as you're speaking that China has overtaken our position on the Navy as #1 now in the world. So we certainly need to build up the Navy, but I'm glad to see the ships were deployed quickly and in deterrence to any situation. And yes, I was aware they did not cross into our territorial, I guess they say the international waters there, but.
Still, it was a signal for sure. And signals in military signals are important to heed, and they're, I think, important to respond to. In this case, I think we talked about last time that one of the naval officials suggested we should start something akin to RIMPAC in the Arctic, Rim of the Pacific, a huge naval cooperation effort that happens annually with the U.S. and its allies. I think that a good counter signal to what the Russians and Chinese did would be, you send 11 ships here, well, the United States and its allies are going to bring 40 ships here, and we'll do it every year. And we'll do it as long as we have to. We can do this all day, and to recreate, as I think it was the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, said, he wasn't thinking out loud. He was saying we need to do this, and I think that's something that's coming. But have an Arctic version of RIMPAC, and that, by the way, is another reason we need a larger Navy, but to signal and to respond to signals. But also we need to work with allies because we can't do this alone.
Yes, in your article you brought up that point too, and it's stated that we are having exercises with Finland and Finland's military, as well as, it looks like you said, Britain, Norway, and Sweden.
Right. Lots of activity in and around the European Arctic, and then some of it in Alaska and Canada too. But the elements of the 11th Airborne deployed along with the 10 Mountain Division to Finland this spring, or I don't think it felt like spring to the guys who and the women who deployed. But and the Finns also hosted large-scale exercises in the spring above the Arctic Circle. The Europeans use the phrase of the high north. A lot of times you'll hear that. Thousands of U.S. and allied troops, the Brits, as you mentioned, the Netherlands, involved in some of the operations, Norwegians. It was interesting to me, going back to the Navy, I know this wasn't the focus of our discussion today, Joy, but it was interesting to me that the USS Gerald Ford, in its first operational deployment, sailed into the Arctic. That was a very interesting signal, and trained with the Norwegian Armed Forces. That was an interesting signal that happened this year as well.
Yes, I saw that in your paper. That it was. And of course, we send signals as well going through the Taiwan Straits and South
That's right, and I think that's right, and this is a way that the Chinese are reacting or responding. That's true, and the Russians too. Certainly, the Chinese are doing that, saying we can surge near your territory, just as you are surging near what they call their territory. Of course, Taiwan is not their territory,
right.
But that's certainly what they think. By the way, speaking on that point, there are Russian lawmakers who think that Russia needs to take back Alaska. I mean, literally, there are somewhat prominent members of the Russian Duma who've talked about that and proposed that. I mean, obviously, that's not something that I think that's on the minds of the Russian military high command, which has got its hands full and then some in what it's done in Ukraine. But we're dealing with a neo-imperialist, expansionist, dictatorship here. And we have to keep that in mind that they understand force. They don't really want to talk about things. Doesn't mean we should go to war or threaten war with them, but we need to make it clear that we're prepared to defend our interests and our allies.
It's interesting you brought that up, because it actually was going to be a question I was going to ask you, is do you think Alaska is in any danger of Russian encroachment, as we have seen with Crimea and Ukraine?
I don't think that's what Russia would want to do. I think it wants to be a distracting or I don't want to use the word annoyance, but to have distractions up there in the high north, up there around Alaska, to send signals. I don't think it craves or wants any part of an open conflict against the United States. However, Joy, many major crises and wars have started by mistake, because ships get too close to each other, airplanes get too close to each other. What we call the National Command Authority intended to happen doesn't happen down at the tactical level. So that these kinds of interactions can lead to or trigger things that can get out of hand, and that's why it's important. Churchill used to use the phrase, "We don't want to act on narrow margins, which tempt fate." So narrow margins is things like having only 298 ships when you need 500. I mean, you need to have an overwhelming force. You need to have allies working shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, so that the poachers like Russia and the rising powers like China know what they're dealing with and don't tempt fate.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up, because we stated last time about China being an observer, non-Arctic nation observer. And I wanted to bring up that there are 13 non-Arctic observer states. I did not know that until I looked into the Arctic Council. A lot of them, and I brought up China mainly because of the tensions with the U.S. and kind of their cozying to Russia as well. And I certainly wouldn't think Russia wants to approach Alaska at this point, especially with Ukraine going on. But if they were working with China, maybe it could be another issue. So I would ask you, is there a possibility you think that Russia may try to form a separate Arctic type forum with China and maybe some other non-Arctic observer states?
I think they certainly could, and they may do that, form a parallel entity or something. They've done that in other parts of the world. And I certainly could see China and Russia serving as the foundation of that and having some ad hoc constellation of authoritarian regimes that see the world the way they do, agreeing on that. The good news about that, and I think your premise of your question is sound, Joy, that they could definitely do that, and it's not outside the realm. But the good news and the counter to that is it's not like there's any other countries that have a toehold in the Arctic. They're all American allies, and close allies. As you mentioned, let's count it. They're all NATO allies. Sweden is joining NATO very soon. So every one of those, call them the Arctic Seven, are NATO members. So it's not like some other country can get its nose under the tent. China calls itself a near Arctic state, which I think I mentioned to you is just silly. But it's a big power and has a lot of money to throw around, and now it's got a military to throw around. So I think your premise is very sound. I just don't know what that entity would be able to do beyond what Russia can do, which, as your maps show and underscore, and as anyone who's just listening to the podcast, just look at a map. Russia has a vast coastline that is much of it in the Arctic. So Russia has real legitimate, by the way, territorial and security interest in the Arctic, and then it has some not legitimate ways of justifying some of the things, and then doing some things that are, I think, not legitimate and certainly not helpful or beneficial to the whole of the Arctic community. But I think you're right; that could definitely happen.
And I pose that because of China also does similar things, and
absolutely. But if our listeners, the viewers, when they get a chance, go to the Arctic Council's website, it's another thing. Look at the observer states. Almost all of them are close American allies as well. Many of them are treaty allies of the United States. And all of them, except for China, as I glance at that, are liberal democracies. India's, I think, an observer or wants to be an observer. Maybe it's moving toward liberal democracy. It's certainly a democracy. So so I think the ability of success of such a parallel structure would be questionable. That, though, raises the question. I don't know what the Arctic Council can do. Literally, to use the metaphor of the Arctic, it's just frozen right now. Joy, it was born in 1996 in a time of optimism, East-West friendship, Russia a fledgling and emerging and committed democracy. And it's just a very different world than it was in 1996. In fact, it's a world much more like 1976 when it comes to East-West relations. So the Arctic Council may be something that, the Arctic Council, it has nothing in its charter, nothing at all talks about issues related to security. So the discussions that these countries have to have now, as you with your maps underscore, as Russia lines the Arctic with reopened military bases and new military bases, really have to be done in the arena of security, not just resource development and making sure waterways are ecologically sound and things.
Right, and the Arctic Council did suggest in here that Russia has removed paragraphs in its statement on Arctic policy away from cooperation with the other member states. Obviously, they're all NATO, as we discussed, so I can understand why they're doing this. That's what made me wonder if they would go separately from the Arctic Council and try to form their own global forum?
I think that's very, very possible, and that's literally, we're going back to the future in that case. That's the way things were before, and sadly, I think that's the path Russia has chosen. No one has made Russia choose these pathways that it's chosen. That's what Russia and its apologists are saying, but that's truly, literally propaganda. So.
And you brought up a good point about India too, because I was going to, as I was talking about that, but in the Arctic Council, I'm quoting this, India is the only developing country apart from China to have a permanent research station in the Arctic since 2008.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So I thought that was interesting because the increasing accessible Arctic also has a potential to address India's rising energy needs and its deficiencies in the strategic rare earth elements.
For sure, and that's why the Arctic's riches, the treasures of the Arctic, if they can be developed and accessed through the normal conventions of treaty development and friendly relations and international arbitration and safe extraction practices, the Arctic could be a key to development of the global South and also sustained development throughout the world. But that's not the pathway Russia wants to take. Not today's Russia. The Russia of the 1990s was on that track, and Putin's Russia is not taking that path.
No,
I think India is quite open to that, and India, I think, has shown it wants to see a world that is an open world and has norms of behavior that are accepted, and practices that are of a different century need to be left in the past. Like taking territory by force and things like that. But Russia literally is behaving like the Russian Empire and like other empires of the 1800s and up until the World War I, World War II era.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. And I mean, a lot of that, I'm sure, like we discussed, is the resources. And I also would point out the North Sea route for transportation.
Right.
That China is also interested in.
Yeah, they say it could cut 4,000 miles off of the normal, the existing, trade routes, shipping routes. And that's a huge amount of, time is money, as you and I know, and that cuts time. That means it saves money. And for Europe to Asia and Asia to Europe trade, that is a huge amount of, that's truly transformative when it comes to shipping. Also, by the way, that raises, wherever there are ships, there's a possibility of accidents, and because nothing made by man is perfect, and humans make mistakes, nothing nefarious. So that raises the need really for countries that are Arctic nations. Again, this is why the Arctic Council was created, to work together to help prevent ecological problems from becoming a disaster, and to ensure free flow and have coastal nations protected, and to make sure there's some rules of the road as cut ships and flagged ships travel those 4,000 miles, cut the 4,000 miles from the global shipping and go over the top of the world. But that's going to be very difficult if Russia is keeping countries, not working with the other Arctic countries and keeping countries from its territory. Just the other day, by the way, in preparation for our interview, Joy, I noticed that Russia just announced out of the blue August 7th or 8th, so yesterday or the day before, that a big chunk of the Barents Sea is off limits to air and naval activity because they are going to have missile tests. So they gave all these Arctic nations and anybody who has ships moving in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea about 24, 30 hours notice, and said, we're just going to shut down two big swaths of this territory because we're going to do missile tests. So that kind of stuff.
I did not hear that one. Thank you for letting us know.
So that kind of stuff, there's no coordination because of Russia's behavior, because there is no real functioning Arctic Council. those kinds of things will happen increasingly,
And unfortunately, they have, like we discussed, a major part of the Arctic, which would be the Arctic transportation route there in the North Sea.
That's right.
So
well, they're
it
an
could
Arctic
be used
power.
for something good, but if they're going to push it, then that way it's...
That's right. And it's not going to be... Putin will deal with the West based on force, and he'll push as far as he can until there's a pushback or a line drawn. But you have to be ready to draw that line, and you have to be ready to push back. In the Arctic, we're only now really, and I mean this, the last maybe 30 months are we starting to push back and draw lines. And that, when I say we, I mean the United States and its NATO allies, and that's long overdue because of the way Putin's been behaving.
Yes, well, it's definitely becoming the next frontier, so to speak, and obviously there's a lot of resources there that many of our countries are interested in, as well as the ice melting presents problems elsewhere. But
that's right.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring up the Peace Through Strength solutions, which we pretty much touched on as far as our readiness. And like you discussed, we are just now starting to pull our troops more and more toward Arctic and be ready in the Arctic with our allies. So that's very important.
Right. And it's always, and I think that's great that you've added that over the last year or so. It's always talking about what's the Peace Through Strength angle. And it is partly the United States getting serious about Arctic security, investing in reconstituting a naval force, but also really working with allies so that we're not stepping on each other's toes, so that we're not duplicating our efforts, so that the Canadians focus on a certain thing that they're niche and good at. The Norwegians do the same. The Swedes, the Finns, Americans, on and on it goes. It's really important that NATO help those Arctic nations do that. And the good news is NATO Secretary General has talked about that. And now you have these allies starting to work together with more, not just more Arctic exercises, but higher tempo and much more, I would say, serious and, for lack of a better term, credible kinds of exercises that make it clear that the allies are ready to defend, norms of behavior in the Arctic like they are in other parts of the world.
Yes, I was thinking the exact same thing. We've got a lot of parts of the world to deter.
And we can't do it alone.
And we can't. So we definitely need our allies, so we're thankful for that.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Alan. I appreciate your article and briefing us on what's going on in the Arctic.
Joy Day, as always, Joy.
And thank you to our listeners. You can read all of Alan's articles on our website at www.ascf.us. Subscribe to our newsletter to receive all updated articles and podcasts. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And subscribe and comment to our YouTube and Rumble channels by typing in American Security Council Foundation. Thank you, Alan. Thank you to our listeners. Please join us again next time for more Peace Through Strength podcasts.